So we have talked about why global biomes form and how they form. And we now need to talk about what those biomes are, both biomes on land, terrestrial biomes, and biomes on water. And I know you guys have been through biomes, obviously, several other times. You started biomes in 5th grade, you saw them again in middle school, and you've seen them in high school in biology. What you need to know about biomes is a little bit different in apes, so we're going to keep the focus on what you need to know for the exam. Some of this will be review, and some of it will be brand new to you. Believe it or not, there's new things to learn about biomes. Terrestrial biomes are biomes that exist on the land. So first off, like I said before, biomes exist on where they exist on Earth is largely determined by atmospheric convection currents, and that has to do with the circulation of the Hadley cells, the Ferrel cells, and the polar cells, and both surface and deep oceanic circulation patterns. Global thermohaline circulation, that would be the deep circulation patterns, and the prevailing wind system that causes the surface currents. Terrestrial biomes are geographic regions that have a particular combination of temperature and precipitation and have distinctive plant growth forms that are adapted to that climate. Terrestrial biomes are actually characterized, they're named after their predominant plant species. Aquatic biomes are categorized by specific combinations of salinity, depth, and water flow. Not necessarily the plant species, because obviously in some aquatic biomes, actual plants are few and far between. This is a climatograph. This particular diagram shows up now and again on the multiple choice section of the exam. So let's take a look at what's going on here, because you actually need to know how to read this and what you're looking at. You can see underneath here I've written biomes are characterized by specific ranges of temperature and precipitation. So when I use this when I'm teaching teachers or where I'm teaching students, the first thing that I ask people to do is to take a look at the axes. The x-axis is average annual temperature, and the y-axis is average annual precipitation. So what are the two factors that biomes are characterized by? Well, those two factors are what's on the x and y-axis. That's temperature and precipitation. You can see here that this graph is generally triangular. So we're going to start here in this corner where we have 0 precipitation and -10 degrees Celsius, by the way, average annual temperature. And as you would expect, if you have low precipitation and low temperature, you have the tundra biome, which you see right here. Okay, and notice that the tundra biome is a kind of a funny shape. All these are funny shapes. Well, why is that? Well, take a look at what is happening in that shape on the x and the y axis. So the tundra has an x range of about -10 to about, I would say, -3 there in terms of average annual temperature. And then if you take a look at this side right here of the tundra, right, you notice that it's also got a y range. So it's got a y range that goes from about 0 average annual precipitation, and this is in centimeters, by the way, to just under 100 centimeters in average annual precipitation. And the reason why all of these are these shapes is because they have ranges for both their x and their y values. Let's just take temperate grassland, which is also considered cold desert, down here. Temperate grasslands, they have seasons. They're temperate, which means that they have, they're mid-latitude, so they have winter, spring, summer, fall. So you get, between those seasonal variations, quite a bit of an average annual temperature range. Now, they're cold deserts, right? And so if they're categorized as a desert at all, they're going to be low on the precipitation scale. So you can see that the y value over that x value is actually fairly small here. But, you know, if you were to take this point to this point, that's their maximum y value there. All of these biomes exist in a temperature and precipitation range, and that has to do with either seasonal variation or variations in things like wet and dry seasons, if we're talking about particularly equatorial seasonal forests and things like that, temperate and equatorial seasonal forests. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum from tundra is tropical rainforest, and that's at this peak right here. And again, what you'd expect of tropical rainforest is that it's high on the average annual precipitation, and that's what you find, and it's also high on the average annual temperature. Average annual precipitation actually ranges more than does temperature. The X values here are actually of a smaller range, between 20 and 30, than the average annual precipitation. The Y value there is actually larger. And that's, you can, for any one of these odd shapes, you can actually go ahead and take a look at your X range and your Y range, and you can predict, like if they were to leave one of these off, one of these biomes off, and we're going to talk about each one of these biomes as we get further in, but if they were to blank one or two of them out, you could predict which biome should be there based on its X and Y values of average annual temperature and precipitation, because you're an APE student, and because you're my student, and because I'm going to teach you how to do that. All right, so you've probably seen a map kind of like this before. We use this in biology. These are Earth's major biomes by latitude. The key is on this side, so you can see kind of what you're looking at. And there's lots of different colors here. You know, the thing the takeaway from this particular map here is that biomes vary by latitude, and they also vary by altitude. So you can see that if you're looking at latitude bands here, you find similar biomes at similar latitudes. And then you find things like this, like right here. I want to kind of point this out. What is this? Well, this is the Rocky Mountains. So you've got these a dry area, which is categorized here as desert and semi-desert, which is the central part of the United States. But then you have these two weird blue things coming down. Well, those blue things coming down are mountain zones. If you look right here, that's the Rocky Mountain range, and it has it actually extends further south. The mountains have very different characteristics than the plains and the grasslands that surround them. And you can see that here's another example of that. And it's surrounded by semi-desert. And there's examples of that throughout the world. So again, the temperatures, they vary by latitude. The characteristics of the biome vary by latitude and by altitude. So let's just start off with some of our terrestrial biomes. We're going to start with the tundra. The tundra is a cold, dry, treeless biome that's characterized by low growing, and it's also slow growing vegetation. It's low to the ground and it grows very, very slowly. Tundra most often occurs between 60 and 90 degrees north and south latitude, but it can also be found at high altitudes. Remember, latitude and altitude. You can find tundra at the tops of high mountains, and we call that alpine tundra. Tundra soil is completely frozen in the winter, and it thaws partially during the summer, but only the top layers. Permafrost is an impenetrable, permanently frozen layer of soil that underlies those top soil layers. Tundra soils are very fragile due to low rates of decomposition and low rates of plant growth. And they also are actually soggy. They're waterlogged. In the Arctic summer, if you were to walk on the ground there, it's like walking on a saturated sponge. And the reason why is that water cannot percolate down through the soil past that frozen layer that we call permafrost. So the permafrost is permanently frozen, the top layers thaw, and they're very, very squishy because the water can't go anywhere. The other thing about the tundra to note is that when this does happen, you get an absolute swarm of influx of insects. Insects are present in the tundra, and tundra summer is almost unbearable with the number of insects, especially biting insects that come out and try to feast on animals during this very short growing season of the tundra summer. Okay, so here is a climatograph for a tundra climate. This happens to be for Barrow, Alaska. This climate diagram, there's two parts to this. You've got a bar graph that shows the precipitation. Oops, I'm moving it instead of writing on it. Right here. and there is a line graph in red that shows the temperature. And this is normally how climatographs work. And I'm not sure why they use blue and red, but they do. Precipitation is usually done on a bar graph in blue, and temperature is usually done on a line graph in red. And that's kind of the standard. So note that the temperature, like let's take a look here. This precipitation, by the way, is in millimeters on the y-axis, and the temperature is in degrees centigrade, okay, on the x-axis. The J, F, M, A, M, J, those stand for the months. So you have January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, whatever. The thing to note here is that the temperature is only above freezing. This is freezing during June, July, and August, which are the months of the Arctic growing season. And they're not very much above freezing. So here's freezing, right? Here's 0 degrees, right there. And so you only get your temperature above 0 degrees for 3 months of the year. And that's the Arctic growing season. Something to note when we read all graphs. Please, 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 please. And again, when I teach Saturday school for both teachers and students for APES exam, the first thing that I ask them to do when they're presented with a graph is to look at the x-axis, look at the y-axis, find out what the unit of measurements are, and take a look at your scale. Each one of these climatographs is going to have a different scale based on obviously, a climatograph like this for the tundra, this scale would be way too low to do the rainforest for. So again, when you're going to see a graph that looks very similar to this for each one of these biomes, but you really need to pay attention to your X and Y values and the scales that they're using, because if you don't, you're going to screw yourself up. Just because they look similar doesn't mean they're actually showing similar things. So be careful when you look at graphs. And again, here's 0, so you get your Arctic growing season here. And if I were to put a line curve over moisture patterns here, right, for the Arctic, you would see that you do get a spike right here. There's the Arctic, January, February, there's precipitation falling here. June, July, and August, these are our low moisture periods. Now the precipitation is actually quite low. If you look on the side there, the Arctic is a cold biome. It's also dry, so you're not getting a ton of precipitation, but most of that precipitation is falling in the winter, and it's falling as snow. The boreal forest biome is also called the taiga. And in 9th grade, you would have heard it as taiga. Taiga is the Russian word for boreal forest. It's what the Russians call that. And the reason that we use the Russian word a lot of times is because so much of Russia is boreal forest that we came to accept their word for it. The boreal forest is characterized by coniferous evergreens. Boreal forest is wetter than the tundra. Remember, tundra is cold and dry. So the plant growth there is more constrained by temperature than precipitation. And again, if you take a look at the characteristic plant life in the boreal forest, it's large coniferous trees. Trees cannot grow without enough moisture. And so again, this is a much wetter biome, but it's still quite cold. Boreal forest soils are very poor in nutrients because the rates of decomposition there are very slow due to the temperature. Boreal forests have short growing seasons, but their growing seasons are slightly longer than the tundra. Here's a climatograph for a typical boreal forest. This is northern Canada. It's Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And again, you notice that the precipitation is in blue bar graph and the temperature is in red line graph. In this particular one, they showed you the values down here at the bottom, but most of the time they don't. You just have to infer them from the graph. And again, it kind of looks in terms of the shape of the graph, it looks kind of similar to the tundra graph, but take a look here. The first thing I need you to notice is that, let's see here. The curve of the moisture pattern is different. You get a peak. The peak here happens later. Again, a lot of this moisture is falling right here in these months. So May, June, July, August. That would be in the summer months. So while it snows here, you're actually getting rain in the summer months in a boreal forest. The other thing to note is where the 0 is. Here's freezing, right there. And so a large proportion of your temperature graph is above freezing for much of the year. So you get June, July, August, September, and October. That's 5 months that is above freezing, 2 months longer than the tundra. So you get a much longer growing season there. And these are the things that I want you to pay attention to because climatographs are fair game. They showed up in the 2010 exam and again in 2012. Temperate rainforests. Temperate rainforests occur in the mid-latitudes. Anytime you see the word temperate, we're talking about a mid-latitude biome. They occur in the mid-latitudes and they occur along coastlines. Again, rainforest, you're going to have lots of moisture there. Well, if it's a mid-latitude biome, where are you going to find the moisture? You're going to find it along the coasts. The temperature extremes here are mitigated by proximity to the ocean, which also gives you that nice humidity that creates the rainforest. This biome has mild summers and winters, and they're milder than inland biomes at the same latitude. The reason why is because they're close to the ocean, and the ocean has a mitigating effect on temperature. Temperate rainforests are very biodiverse. They contain large, usually old growth forest trees. What do I mean by old growth? That means that they have reached a climax community. They are at the, I want you to think about what you know about primary and secondary succession. So these forests have gone through succession and they are now at a stable climax community. They contain extremely large trees, which means that they are also biodiverse. Such trees are attractive as timber, however. So there's a lot of pressure to log these big old growth forests. And many temperate rainforests have been logged out and converted to single species tree farms, which is a dang shame because they're pretty much amazing to look at. Here's another climatograph. And again, notice that the temperature is in the red graph and we're in the red line graph, and precipitation is in the blue bar graph. Now these blue bars happen to kind of run together, but it's the same idea. This is a temperate rainforest biome. And again, I like to kind of map my two lines there so I can see the overall trend. The lowest precipitation is in the summertime, May, June, July, August, coming back up in September. As you can see, that's the dip. That's right here in this area. And that, of course, corresponds to the highest temperature. But I want you to take a look at the precipitation. Now, this precipitation is, again, in millimeters, lots higher, so much higher than the two biomes that we just talked about. The average temperature, again, this average temperature, look where 0 is now. It's down at the very bottom of the graph. And again, every time you look at a climatograph, please, 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 the x-axis down here is always going to be the month. And the precipitation is going to always be on the left and temperatures are going to always be on the right. However, the scale will not be the same. And if you fail to look at the scale, you could screw yourself up. All right, so note that the precipitation is lowest and temperature highest in the summer months, May, June, July, and August. But precipitation is abundant and temperatures are still mild during these months. Okay, so we were just talking about temperate rainforests. Now we're going to talk about temperate seasonal forests. So again, remember that temperate means that they're found in the mid-latitudes. Seasonal forest means that they have seasons. A temperate seasonal forest biome is inland. It's mid-latitude, and this is the biome that comprises much of the United States and Europe. So when you're thinking about, winter, spring, summer, fall, changing of the seasons, trees losing their leaves, you're thinking about a temperate seasonal forest. It's characterized by broadleaf deciduous trees. Deciduous means that they lose their leaves, warm summers, and cold winters. Because deciduous trees shed their leaves and rates of decomposition are relatively high, because rainfall is actually relatively high, the soils of this biome are rich and they're fertile. Due to the soil fertility, this biome was the first to be converted to agriculture by European settlers. This is also because when they landed on the Atlantic coast, this is the biome that they encountered, was temperate seasonal forest, which, by the way, at that same latitude is the biome that they left. England is temperate seasonal forest on its coast, on the Atlantic coast there. So they sailed across the Atlantic, and when they got over here to the, well, it wasn't the United States then, but to America, they found the same biome. So it was like New England. Oh, New England. They were seeing the same biome there. It felt very much like home. They knew exactly what to do. They chopped down the trees and planted stuff. All right, so here's another climatogram. This happens to be Daegu, Korea, which, yes, also has temperate seasonal forests. Note that the precipitation here, again, precipitation, where did I say it was going to be? Right over here. Temperatures over here. And we've got our months along the bottom. So note that the precipitation is lower and the temperature is higher than the temperate rainforest in all months. So we go, if I was going to map the tops of this, we have a distinct peak. Where does most of that rainfall come? It comes during the summer months, June through September. That is also when the temperature peaks, but please notice zeros here on this graph. They could have actually overlapped this. They could have moved zero down, in my particular opinion, whoever did this graph. They could have moved zero down here and overlaid these two, but zero's up here, doesn't matter. Notice that these temperatures are actually fairly mild. Here's 30 degrees centigrade. 40 degrees is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking fairly mild temperatures even at their hottest, and that is typical of temperate seasonal forests. Okay, the woodland shrubland biome is known by many names around the world, and when you read your Friedman and Relea chapter, they actually tell you the different cultural names of this biome. The reason that there's so many names is because it's found in so many different places around the world. When you were in 9th grade biology, we called this biome Chaparro, which is right here. It's also sometimes called Mediterranean chaparral. The reason for this is that it was first identified in the Mediterranean region. And it also characterizes the chaparral area of northern Mexico, which is why we've kind of combined those two terms. But if you were talking about this biome in general worldwide, we'd call it woodland shrubland. The growing season of this biome lasts all year. Please remember that growing season means the months of the year that are above freezing. So plant growth is not necessarily constrained here by temperature, since the growing season is all year long, but it is constrained by moisture. The summers here are very hot and very dry. So because of that, moisture is our limiting factor. This biome is adapted to periodic drought and periodic wildfires. Now, this part is important. There are several biomes that are actually naturally adapted to having wildfires. The woodland shrubland, or the chaparral, is one of those biomes. Many plants here are drought resistant, and they produce seeds that can only germinate in response to fire. The reason I am pointing this out to you is that this has actually been a test question multiple times. They want you to know which biomes are naturally adapted for fire. So this is one of them. Soils here are low in nutrients. Why? Well, the first reason is that the soils are pretty sandy. They're high in sand content, and so they do not actually hold nutrients. There is also intense leaching during the heavy winter rains. So when the rain actually does come during the winter, the nutrients leach down into the lower soil horizons, and they're not available to plants. In terms of human use, grazing of livestock is a common human use of the woodland shrubland biome. Here is a climatogram for chaparral, for the chaparral biome. The biome has hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, like we said before. Again, check this out. This one says column 2, column 4. Remember that this one's going to be precipitation, and this one's going to be temperature, because those are our normal conventions on these maps, and again months along the bottom. So you can see that the temperature really soars in the summertime. Look how hot it gets up here. This is 35 degrees. Remember I told you that 40 degrees was 100. So this point right here is right about 100 degrees. But it's pretty warm all year long. It never really gets fairly close to zero, but never all the way. Well, excuse me, I take that back. Right here, here's our temperature in degrees centigrade. So it really, if you kind of follow it across, it really never gets super close to freezing. And then again, if you were to take, and remember what Bagley likes to do, I like to kind of put my points here. You can see that almost all of the moisture here occurs in the winter months. December is very, very wet, with a falling off January, February, March, but there's almost no precipitation at all during the summer, which is also when the temperature spikes. So the plants here need to be adapted to drought-like conditions during these months, and they need to be able to reproduce very quickly during the wet months when they have moisture. Temperate grasslands. It's the third time I'm going to say it, but temperate means that we're talking about mid-latitudes. Temperate grasslands occur on the interior of continents. Grasslands are when we're talking about temperate grasslands, they're found where it's relatively dry, and they're usually found in the interior of continents. They are also known as prairies, pampas, or steppes. Prairies in the United States, pampas in South America, and steppes in Asia. It is the same biome, but you can hear them referred to in different ways for different countries. When we're talking about a prairie biome or prairie ecosystem, we're talking about temperate grasslands. And yes, there are different types of prairies. There's long grass, tall grass prairie, and short grass prairie. Same deal with pampas and steppes, but in general, they're all considered temperate grasslands. They're characterized by cold, harsh winters and hot, dry summers. Precipitation is the main limiting factor for plant growth. These are dry biomes. Typical plants here are grasses and non-woody flowering plants. Non-woody means that they don't have bark. Okay, they can flower, but they're like flower stems. They're not bark. They don't have bark on the outside. Roots of these species are very deep in the soil. The roots penetrate. They're usually tap roots. I don't know if you are familiar with the different types of roots. The tap roots are the ones that go kind of straight down and have really, really long roots that go down. There's also kind of web roots that kind of spread out. The roots of these plants are very deep in the soil. This is an adaptation. It actually also helps to prevent erosion during dry, windy conditions. Remember, this is a dry biome, so when the soil begins to dry out, the grass, the very, very strong root system of the grasses holds it in place. This is another biome that is adapted to fire. The two major biomes that are adapted to fire are the temperate grasslands and the woodland shrubland, the chaparro biomes. So that's the answer to the test question, by the way. Wildfires are common in grasslands, and they're a natural occurrence. In fact, there are areas where that are grassland areas where scientists actually go and do controlled burns, because if they don't, we get invasive species coming in there. There are plants that cannot germinate if they're not exposed to fire. And so we're now beginning to recognize that fire is a natural and necessary part of biome management. Here's a grassland climatograph, another climatograph. Notice the dual peaks for precipitation in May, June, and September, October. Here's our precipitation. Now, this precipitation happens to be in centimeters. Again, most precipitation you see is going to be in millimeters. This one happens to be in centimeters. Don't get freaked out or anything. You just need to make sure that you look at your scale. Like I've said, like 5 times already on this presentation. Look at your scale and make sure you know what you're looking at. Be able to convert centimeters to millimeters, one of our dimensional analysis issues. So there is a peak here for precipitation in May and June. There is also a peak in September, like right here, September, October. So we've got a dual peak. It's actually kind of more like August, September, October right here. So we get a peak here, and we get a peak here. There's dual peaks here. During the wintertime months in a grassland, this area is very, very dry. So you end up with, and again, this is like 2 centimeters down here when we're talking about wintertime. So 20 millimeters. When we're talking about how much moisture it gets. Again, that's the limiting factor here. And the temperature right here, it's obviously in degrees centigrade. Not nearly as high as the Chaparro. We're at kind of a peak of about 25, 26. So, you know, 80s, maybe getting up to 90. They're hot, but they're not as hot as the Chaparro. Tropical rainforests. Everybody loves the tropical rainforest biome, right? They're warm, they're wet. They lie between the equator and 20 degrees north and south latitude. Why? Well, we already know this. You guys have seen stuff on this before. It's where the ascending branches of those tropical Hadley cells cause warm, moist air to rise and then condense. And of course, the Coriolis effect is what causes it to spread out and lose all its moisture between the equator and about 30 degrees. Tropical rainforests are found between the equator and 20 degrees. After that, things get a little bit drier. You get tropical seasonal forest, and then you get desert. So there's very little seasonal variation in either temperature or precipitation. Primary productivity is extremely high, and decomposition is very, very rapid. Tropical rainforests are the most biodiverse per hectare than any other biome on the planet. Lush vegetation uptakes most of the ecosystem's nutrients and leaves the soil nutrient poor. So let's talk a little bit about deforestation. Because there is such luxuriant plant growth in the tropical rainforest, all of the soil's nutrients is held within the bodies of plants. When you cut those plants down and burn them, you are returning some of those nutrients in the form of ash to the soil. This is slash and burn agriculture. However, the soil is nutrient poor just by nature because the plants held all the nutrients. When this area is deforested, the soil not only oxidizes quickly, it's an iron oxide based soil. If you've ever seen any pictures, the soil of deforested rainforests is very, very red. It's what they call an oxisol. So it oxidizes quickly, it loses its fertility quickly, and it is extremely prone to erosion. When you're thinking about the characteristics of a tropical rainforest, it has a very high canopy and not a whole lot of underbrush. So because the canopy is so dense and so high, it kind of blocks sunlight from the forest floor. So when you cut down those big trees and you burn them, some of that ash enriches the soil and you can farm on it for a few seasons. But after that, the soil has no more fertility and they have to move on to a different patch of tropical rainforest. If that rainforest is left alone, it can go through secondary succession. But obviously, if it's going through secondary succession, then its biodiversity is like a fraction of what it was when it was at climax tropical rainforest. Here's a tropical rainforest climatograph. Same conventions. We've got our temperature in our line graph up here and our precipitation here. Now, there's a little bit of variation in precipitation. There's almost no variation in temperature. This is typical for a tropical rainforest. And just in general, the reason I'm showing you the climatographs, the way that they have asked questions about biomes in the past is they give you the climatographs and then they ask you questions like, which biome is the most biodiverse? Or which biome would have the greatest biodiversity of trees? Or which of the biomes shown above would be adapted to fire? So you need to know what the climatographs look like in order to be able to answer those questions. What's the normal temperature? What's the normal precipitation? They did not used to ask those kind of questions. These are new in the last few years, but they've become quite important. Okay. Tropical seasonal, this should say seasonal forest, not season forest, tropical seasonal forest, and savanna. These are those forests that I told you were kind of on the fringe of the tropical rainforest. So if you're thinking about the structure of the earth, you've got the equator. Then between 0 degrees and 20 degrees north and south latitude, you have tropical rainforest. And then between 20 and 30, you have these tropical seasonal forests or savannas. And then, of course, at 30 degrees north and south latitude, you have the world's great deserts. So this biome is characterized by distinct wet and distinct dry seasons. And this is caused by the movement of the intertropical convergence zone during the course of the year. Look, it's Earth systems telling you where a biome is, believe it or not. So you end up, obviously, where the land is doesn't change, but what's happening to the land changes based on the ITCZ. So if the area has slightly more moisture, we call it a tropical seasonal forest. Why did I leave the AL off of the seasonal forest? If it's a slightly drier, it ends up producing a savanna. So tropical seasonal forests have more trees. Savannas have fewer trees, but they do have some trees. The presence of trees is what distinguishes savannas from grasslands. Okay. Warm temperatures and high humidity during the rainy season promote decomposition. So although you'd expect these soils to be kind of dried out, not so fertile, they're actually relatively fertile. And that's because they do have a pronounced wet season where everything kind of decomposes. Here's a Serengeti climatogram. Believe it or not, it was really hard for me to find some savanna or tropical seasonal forest climatograms. And this one is kind of blurry because I had to blow it up, but it shows what we need to see. So note the relatively high annual temperature. Check this out. This is our temperature. And again, take a look at your scale. You've got 25, 30. It dips down to like 21, but that's still not very cold. So this is a very warm biome. You also have distinct wet and distinct dry seasons. The wet season is the winter. So you start to ramp up November, December. Here it is. And then you kind of really spike right at kind of at the end. And then the summer is right here. So you end up with a very, very wet winter and a very dry summer, and that is typical, and that is due to the movement of the intertropical convergence zone on the rainy season and the dry season. And actually, there's some other things involved. Sometimes the rainy season comes a little later, sometimes it comes a little earlier, depending on what's going on with the atmosphere. All right, so subtropical, or what we call hot deserts. If I say the word desert, you probably think hot desert, but of course we have cold deserts as well. Subtropical or hot deserts occur at 30 degrees north and south latitude. We've already talked about that. That is where the descending branches of the Hadley cell release their hot, dry air back to the surface. Obviously, deserts have unique plants and animals that are adapted to their very harsh conditions. We're talking cacti, succulents, and desert reptiles and mammals that are designed to reduce water loss in their bodies. Lack of moisture produces slow plant growth and low rates of decomposition. You can imagine what desert soils are like because they have low rates of decomposition, so they're not very high in nutrients. When the rain does come, the plants are adapted to reproduce very, very quickly. Sometimes you hear things about, the desert is blooming. If you have a very brief rainstorm, literally plants will bloom overnight. You go from having dry conditions where kind of nothing seems to be doing anything. If you have a desert rainstorm in the morning, you wake up and everything is in bloom. These plants have to take advantage, reproductive advantage, of extremely scarce and isolated moisture events. So as soon as the moisture comes, they put out their reproductive structures, which, by the way, a flower is a reproductive structure. Welcome back to biology. Desert soils are sandy and they are fragile. If they're disturbed, they take many years to recover. When we talked about soils, we talked about desertification, we talked about desert pavement. I'm going to actually write that here. Desert pavement is what happens when desert soils are disturbed and when their very, very fragile layer of desert topsoil is blown away by wind erosion. This often happens when animals are grazed on fragile desert soils. There are some plants that animals can eat in desert areas, and when they do that, they rip the roots out, and the plants no longer hold the soil in place. Deserts do have a layer of topsoil. When the wind comes, if the plants are not there, the topsoil erodes, and you end up with this desert pavement, which is compacted, sandy soil characterized by pebbles on the top of it. It's very, very hard, and it's extremely durable. It's very, like, these soils take forever to recover, hundreds and hundreds of years, just because there's no moisture there. So once the land has become what they call pavementized, or become like desert pavement, it won't go back to what it was. It won't go back to what we call fertile desert in our lifetimes. And people think that this is normal. As I'm driving out through West Texas looking at these lands that are very, very degraded, nobody even remembers what they used to look like before they looked like the degraded lands they do now, but that's not their normal state. Here's a desert climate graph. This is for Arizona. You guys by this point should know how to read these. Here's our temperature graph. You can see that it is quite warm. Remember that 40 degrees is about 100 degrees centigrade. And then here's our moisture graph, and precipitation here is in millimeters again. It's rare to see it in centimeters. Just be aware, again, just look at the scale and make sure that you convert if they do something weird on the test. Most of your moisture. Again, and this is something that I've pointed out, although this graph makes the precipitation bars appear large, note that the scale again is in millimeters, with the highest monthly precipitation at only 15 millimeters. When you're doing a graph, when you're creating a graph, you guys know this, you want to choose a scale that's going to maximize what you're looking at. This is why it's super important for the 8 millionth time to take a look at your scale. During the summer, like April, May, June, early summer there, we have very, very little moisture. The moisture comes in the fall, and then again a little bit in the winter. You get a spike here in August, September falling off, and then you get December, January, February, and it falls off. You get a dual spike there in Arizona for precipitation. But again, we're maxing out at 15 millimeters. We're not talking a lot of precipitation. Okay, so we just finished terrestrial biomes. We're going to move into aquatic freshwater biomes. So aquatic biomes, their main classification is, are they salty or are they not salty? So freshwater biomes, we're going to start with streams and rivers. Freshwater biomes include streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, and freshwater wetlands. Streams and rivers are moving water. The APES term for moving water is lotic water. Lotic means moving. Do you need to know that for the exam? Yes, you do. Now, streams and rivers may originate from underground, from springs, or they may originate from rain or from meltwater. Streams are generally lower in volume and narrower than rivers, but that's not always the case. There's not a hard and fast definition of what is a stream and what is a river. The rapidly moving waters of this biome have few plants to act as producers. Organic matter, like stuff that falls in, dead animals, fallen leaves from terrestrial biomes, usually provide the base of the food web in streams and rivers. The moving water is rich in dissolved oxygen. Why? Because it's moving, and when it moves, it churns, and when it churns, it incorporates water into it. And streams and rivers can support aquatic species, particularly fish like salmon and trout, that thrive in oxygen-rich environments. Lakes and ponds are standing water. The APES term for standing water is lentic. Moving water is lotic. Standing water is lentic. And the definition of what is a lake and a pond, well, it's standing water, some of which is too deep to support emergent vegetation. Here's another little APES term. What the heck is emergent vegetation? Emergent vegetation is plants that are rooted on the bottom. And the tops of those plants emerge out of the water. Emergent vegetation. It means it's rooted on the bottom and the tops come out of the water. It's emerging from the water. Lakes are generally considered larger in volume and greater in surface area than ponds, but again, not always. It's just like the streams and rivers thing. We don't have a hard and fast definition of that. Lakes, are divided into several different zones and are also classified according to the level of nutrients and primary productivity. So we're going to talk about first lake zones, and then we're going to talk about levels of nutrients because we need to classify lakes. Okay, the first zone we're going to talk about is the littoral zone. The littoral zone is basically where the water meets the soil. It's the shallow area of soil and water near the shore of a lake where algae and emergent plants grow. And there's that term, emergent plants again. I'm moving things around. Right there. Emergent, remember, means that it's rooted in the ground, rooted in the soil, and the tops are coming out of the water. Most of the photosynthesis in a lake occurs in the littoral zone. Why? Well, you got emergent plants and you've got algae, both of which are doing photosynthesis. As we move away from the littoral zone, away from the shore, we get the limnetic zone. That's the next zone. That is the open water zone. Now, emergent or rooted plants can no longer survive because the water's too deep here. Most of the photosynthesis is being done by phytoplankton. Phyto means plant-like, and plankton are a type of algae. So phytoplankton are photosynthetic algae, and they're really the only producers in the limnetic zone. This zone extends as deep as sunlight can penetrate. So once the sunlight can no longer penetrate, then we move into the next zone, which I'm about to show you. The next zone is the profundal zone. It's aphotic, which means that sunlight cannot reach it. And again, remember that the limnetic zone extends as far as sunlight can penetrate, and that depends on the lake conditions. Lakes that are more turbid, that are cloudier, or have a lot of suspended sediments, the sunlight's not going to penetrate as far. So their photic zone or their euphotic zone, where the sunlight can penetrate, is not as deep, and so their profundal zone is going to begin earlier, or higher up in the water, I should say. So profundal is aphotic, means sunlight cannot reach there. There's no photosynthesis happening here because there's no light, right? And dissolved oxygen levels are therefore pretty low because photosynthetic organisms produce oxygen as a waste product. If there's no photosynthesis happening, there's no oxygen being produced in this area. Bacteria compose detritus here. That's basically what's going on. The benthic zone is the muddy bottom of a lake or pond. And frankly, anytime you see benthic, it's the bottom of an aquatic ecosystem. It happens in oceans too. But and it can be euphotic, meaning that it has light, or aphotic, depending on the depth. I'm going to show you this in the picture that I show you. Benthic just means it's on the bottom. So obviously the bottom of a pond or lake, if it's a shallow area, it's going to have sunlight. If it's not a shallow area, it's not. So the benthic zone is based on depth. It's based on it being the bottom, not light penetration. And here's those lake zones that I was talking about. The littoral zone is the shoreline, and it kind of extends right about to there. It's where you see emergent plants. As soon as the emergent plants can no longer sustain themselves because the water is too deep, you move into the limnetic zone, which is this area right here. Now the limnetic zone is open water, and again, remember that it extends as far as the light can reach. Photic means that, the light can penetrate. Photon, photo, that means light. So whenever the light can no longer penetrate, you get the aphotic or aphotic zone. You hear people pronounce it different ways, which is also the profundal zone. The benthic zone, as I promised, I was going to show you. The benthic zone just means it's on the bottom. So this portion of the benthic zone is photic. This portion of the benthic zone is aphotic. Benthic just means bottom, so it doesn't have to do with light penetration. It has to do with it being on the bottom. Okay, so lakes are further classified. They're classified by zone, but they're also classified by their level of primary productivity. We have 3 levels of primary productivity. The first one we're going to talk about is oligotrophic. Oligotrophic lakes have low primary productivity because they have low amounts of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting agents for plants. Plants need them to grow. If they're present in high amounts, plants grow a lot. If they're present in low amounts, plants don't grow a lot. Oligotrophic lakes tend to be very clear. They tend to be cold, and they tend to be in places where you're not experiencing or don't have the possibility of experiencing runoff events. So this would be places that are like high in altitude or up in the mountains. If you think about a cold, clear mountain lake, cold, clear mountain lakes are oligotrophic. You're not having runoff here that's going to introduce nutrients into the lake. It's cold, so you have slow rates of decomposition. And there's not a lot of, because of the coldness, there's not a lot of emergent plants that are living and dying and creating a nutrient load in the lake. So again, you tend to be able to see the bottom. They're the ones that you think of as, oh, this lake is so beautiful, you can see all the way to the bottom. The reason why is because they don't have any nutrients in them. Mesotrophic lakes have a medium amount of primary productivity and a medium amount of nutrients. Most lakes in the world are mesotrophic. If you were to look at them, they'd be relatively clear, with some turbidity. They have a medium amount of emergent plants, a medium amount of photosynthetic algae, and again, most lakes are going to be classified as mesotrophic lakes. Eutrophic lakes have high levels of primary productivity because they have high levels of nutrients. They often also have large amounts of emergent plants. These occur naturally in areas that are warmer, that have high rates of decomposition. Now, any of an oligotrophic or a mesotrophic lake can actually become eutrophic if you have a runoff event where you have nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that are coming from anthropogenic, man-made sources running into them. You can have a nutrient event, like a runoff event, and you can have a algal bloom or something like that in an oligotrophic or mesotrophic lake. But when we're talking about a eutrophic lake, when we're talking about this type of lake right here, these lakes are eutrophic naturally. They're not experiencing a runoff event. The reason that they're eutrophic is they're generally warm and they generally have large amounts of emergent plants, which are growing, living, and dying, and creating lots of nutrients. Freshwater wetlands are a biome that we didn't talk a whole lot about in biology, so some of this may be new to you. We've already talked obviously about streams and rivers, about ponds and lakes. So wetlands are freshwater aquatic biomes that are submerged or saturated by water for at least part of the year. They're shallow enough to support emergent vegetation throughout the biome. So they don't get deep enough like a lake or a pond where you end up moving away from the littoral zone into the limnetic zone. So they don't have limnetic zone. They're shallow throughout and they can support emergent vegetation throughout. Freshwater wetlands include swamps, marshes, and bogs. And yes, there are APES definitions for them. Swamps, keep doing that. Swamps are wetlands that contain emergent trees. So if you're picturing a swamp, picture basically like a flooded forest. One of the ways, I don't know if you guys have ever seen cypress trees, but we have these cypress swamps. Cypress trees are water tolerant, and they grow in these swampy areas where they're growing basically up out of shallow water. So if the freshwater wetland has trees in it, it's called a swamp. Marshes are wetlands that contain primarily non-woody vegetation like cattails. So if it is an area where there's lots of, it almost looks like a grassland, but the bottom of it instead of being soil is water, it would be considered a marsh. Bogs are acidic wetlands that contain sphagum moss and specialized conifers like spruce or cypress trees. So again, sometimes I just mentioned cypress when we talk about cypress swamps. You could also call it a cypress bog. The difference here is that is the acidity of the water. When we're talking about swamp versus bog, sometimes the line is kind of blurry here. There are other types of trees that can come up out of swamps. In general, we end up with coniferous trees in bogs because when the needles fall, the needles actually release tannic acid, and that acid is what makes the bog acidic. So you can have a cypress swamp. You're going to hear the word cypress swamp. You're going to hear the word cypress bog. It just depends on the region and how acidic the water is. Wetlands are one of the most productive biomes on Earth. When I say productive, I mean in terms of primary productivity. But they're also highly endangered by human development. For most of the time that we've had society, humans have considered wetlands kind of as waste areas. You cannot build on them. You can't do much about them, and they tend to be in areas where people actually want to build, whether they want to build houses or they want to do farmland. Wetlands often stand in the way. So over the course of human history, we've actually drained wetlands. The Army Corps of Engineers is famous for draining wetlands all over the country. Number one, to cut down on insect population, particularly mosquitoes, but also because that land is valuable and people wanted to build on it. So they drained the wetlands. The problem is that wetlands provide critical ecosystem services, such as the reduction of flooding due to a high rate of rainwater absorption and redistribution. Wetlands actually absorb excess rainwater and they redistribute it so that it doesn't flood. They also provide water filtration, which leads to cleaner local groundwater. And this is arguably one of the most important ecosystem services that it does. Without wetlands, our water is not naturally filtered. The water around Dallas, there used to be an extensive network of wetlands around the Trinity River, and the Trinity River water was actually naturally filtered by those wetlands. Most of those wetlands are gone because of the reasons I stated. They drained them so that mosquitoes wouldn't breed, and then also because people wanted to build there. Wetlands also provide nesting, breeding, and migration rest areas for critically endangered bird species. Wetlands are where migratory birds tend to hang out. They either use them as rest areas during migration routes, or they nest and they breed there and then they move on. But without them, our critically endangered bird species become even more critically endangered because they don't have habitat. All right, so we've moved away from freshwater biomes, and we're now going to talk about marine biomes. Marine means saltwater. Marine. The first one we're going to talk about is salt marshes. Salt marshes are found along coasts in temperate areas. Like freshwater marshes, they contain non-woody vegetation. So I want you to think back to when we were talking about freshwater marshes. We said that marshes contain non-woody vegetation. Salt marshes contain non-woody vegetation as well. Like freshwater marshes, salt marshes are some of the most productive biomes on Earth, and by productive, I mean primary productivity. And they're often found in estuaries. So what the heck is an estuary? An estuary is a place where the fresh water of a river meets the salt water of the ocean. This is an important thing. Estuaries tend to be critical habitat for many different species. You get a very unique microbiome in an estuary, and you get species that are adapted to both freshwater and saltwater. Estuaries are neat places, and salt marshes tend to be found where estuaries occur. So rivers carry a heavy nutrient load. As they flow through the land, they pick up nutrients, and they carry this heavy nutrient load down their length, and then they deposit it in the marsh, which is kind of at the mouth of this river in this estuary area. Because they're depositing lots of nutrients in the marsh, it leads to high plant and algae growth in a salt marsh. The abundant plant life also helps to filter contaminants out of the water. So just like Freshwater marshes help to provide the ecosystem services of water filtration. The same is true with salt marshes. Salt marshes also provide critical habitat for spawning fish and shellfish. So thinking about, again, habitat and habitat loss. In freshwater marshes, those are often the sites of habitat for migratory birds. When we're talking about salt marshes, we're talking about habitat for spawning fish and shellfish. Spawning means that they're reproducing. That's the word that we use for fish and shellfish when they're reproducing. Mangrove swamps. Mangrove swamps are swamps that occur along tropical and subtropical coasts, and they're named for the mangrove tree, which you're going to see a picture of here in just a second. Mangrove trees are a salt-tolerant tree species whose roots help protect tropical coastlines from erosion and storm damage. Falling leaves and trapped organic matter create a very nutrient-rich microbiome underneath these tangled root systems. And like salt marshes, mangrove swamps provide a critical habitat for many species, including, again, spawning fish and shellfish. Mangrove swamps have received a lot of study lately. One of the reasons why is there was a large tsunami in the Pacific a few years ago, and it killed many, many people, and it devastated coastal communities in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. It was caused by an underwater earthquake, which caused a large tsunami. Well, in the areas that were most heavily impacted by that tsunami were also areas that would normally have been protected from a tsunami or from a storm surge by mangrove swamps. Mangrove swamps, again, they mitigate the force of a storm surge or a tsunami wave on the coast because they actually absorb the wave's energy. But the areas that were the hardest hit were areas that were that had cleared their mangrove swamps to do commercial shrimp and fish farming along that area. You can't do commercial fish and shrimp farming in mangrove swamps. You actually have to cut down the mangroves so that you kind of have an open water coastal area to do this fish farming. So in the areas that had cut down their mangrove swamps, they experienced a much higher property damage rate and a much larger loss of life than the coastal areas that had intact mangrove swamps. And so with this in mind, a lot of the Southeast Asian governments are attempting regrowth and replanting of their mangrove swamps. It is an incredibly important aquatic biome, and not just for habitat, but also to keep people and coastlines and property safe from storm surges. This is a picture of a mangrove tree's roots both above and below the water, and you can imagine how rich this microbiome is. If you take a look at these roots here, they are holding obviously the bottom of the river, kind of the soil there in place, but throughout here the leaves of this plant, of this mangrove, fall down into the root system and create a nutrient-rich little area there. Fish swim in and out of here. This provides places where fish and shellfish that are spawning can hide. Again, if you were to experience like a storm surge or the energy of a large tsunami wave, the mangrove forests along the coast can actually keep that energy from penetrating too far inland, which is what happened again in Indonesia when we had the tsunami in, I believe it was 2014. That killed so many people because the coastal area had been deforested of their mangrove swamps. So another marine biome is the intertidal zone. Inter means between, tidal means tides. The intertidal zone is the narrow band of coastline that exists between high tide and low tide. You guys probably already know that the ocean has it goes in during part of the day and out during another part of the day. That's high tide and low tide. There are organisms that are adapted to living in the intertidal zone, that narrow band of coastline between high tide and low tide. Intertidal zones, what they look like, their characteristics, very widely. They can be steep and rocky. They can also be broad sloping mudflats, depending on what the tides look like in that particular area of the ocean. Organisms that are adapted to intertidal zones are very hardy. Well, what does that mean? Well, they have to contend with being submerged, completely submerged during high tide. So they're under the ocean water during high tide. But during low tide, they're exposed to the air. So they have to be able to take that very drying, direct sunlight. Think about the beach. The sun is very, very strong there and it beats down. So they have to be able to be completely submerged during high tide and then completely exposed to the air during low tide. The other thing that they have to contend with is crashing waves. So many organisms that are adapted to intertidal zones have adapted ways to kind of glom on or hang on to surfaces so that they can avoid being washed away. Crashing waves can wash organisms out to sea, and that's not where they thrive. So a lot of the intertidal organisms have ways to stick on to a surface. Coral reefs is another marine biome. Coral reefs are found in warm, shallow waters out beyond the coastline. Coral reefs are Earth's most diverse marine biome. So if you didn't know, corals are animals. I know they don't look like animals, but they're animals. They're animals and they secrete an exoskeleton of calcium carbonate. If you were to dissect a living coral, you would find that the outside part of it, which is hard, is actually a hollow tube. Down inside there, the animal itself has little feathery tentacles that live down in there. And different corals have different body shapes, but they're all kind of feathery looking things, and they kind of hide down in the exoskeleton tube. Their exoskeleton is calcium carbonate, CaCO3. That's the chemical formula. They have within their bodies, within their soft bodies, not their exoskeleton, but their actual soft tissue, they have mutualistic single-celled algae. And that algae lives within their tissues. When I talk about mutualistic, sometimes, it's one of our symbiotic relationships. And we're going to talk more about those when we talk about ecology here in the next few weeks. But the coral is receiving a benefit from the single-celled algae, and the single-celled algae is receiving a benefit from the coral. That's the definition of mutualism. The corals actually exhale carbon dioxide that the algae then uses for photosynthesis. And the algae in return releases some of the glucose, some of the sugars it produces, to the coral to be used as food. Where corals live in these warm waters actually tend to be nutrient poor. So corals and this mutualistic algae, they actually co-adapted so that they are both getting what they need. The algae is getting food, the coral's getting food from the algae, and the algae is getting carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis from the coral. Yay, nature. So if you were to take a coral and take a look at it, every individual coral animal they're really actually pretty tiny. But corals are colony animals. Corals live together in large colonies. So when we build up these colonies, we call it a reef. So as the corals live and die and live and die and live and die, their exoskeletons build up over time. And that's what we call a reef. Many other creatures use coral reefs for habitat and as a place to find food, which is what makes it the most biodiverse marine biome. Coral reefs are under severe threat from global climate change. Ocean waters are becoming warmer and they're becoming more acidic. Okay, they're becoming warmer because surface temperatures are becoming warmer. So as surface temperatures rise, water temperature rises. They're becoming more acidic because the larger amount of carbon dioxide in the air, carbon dioxide dissolves in the top layer of the ocean. And the additional carbon uptake creates carbonic acid in that upper layer of the ocean, and that is actually lowering the pH. Now, I say becoming more acidic, and that's exactly how you'll read it. However, ocean water is never going to be actually acidic. It is moving towards the acidic side of the scale. Ocean water is basic because it has many dissolved basic salts in it. When I say it's becoming more acidic, I just mean that its pH is lowering and it's moving towards the acidic side of the scale. But as the water warms and it becomes more acidic, the algae inside the corals die. There's actually, this is kind of actually sad. The corals will actually expel the algae. They have these events that they call a coral bleaching event, where the coral will actually expel its symbiotic algae out of its body. Well, as soon as it does that, it dies, because the algae is giving the coral sugar. And the algae, of course, dies as well, because the algae is getting carbon dioxide from the coral. So without the algae, the coral cannot survive, and the algae cannot survive either, and the entire reef dies, and it's called coral bleaching. The largest reef in the world is called the Great Barrier Reef. It's off the coast of Australia, and 90% of it is under a bleaching event right now. It's actually pretty sad. Coral reefs are really, really, really endangered. The open ocean is another marine biome. The open ocean is the deep ocean water away from coastlines where sunlight can no longer reach the ocean bottom. The area of the ocean that's closest to the coastline is called the continental shelf. You're going to see this in a picture, so don't freak out yet. As we move away from the continental shelf, the sunlight can no longer reach all the way to the bottom. When we hit that area, that's called open ocean. And just like lakes, the open ocean is divided into zones where light can penetrate and zones where light cannot reach. So the upper layer of the ocean is called the photic zone, or euphotic zone. Why? Because that's where sunlight can penetrate, and that's where photosynthesis in the open ocean occurs. The lower zones of the ocean are aphotic. This is photic, aphotic. Okay? Meaning that no sunlight reaches down there. Now the aphotic zone can range from kind of high aphotic zone, where creatures are still going kind of in and out, all the way down to the ocean bottom, which is called the benthic zone. It's the same. Benthic zone is the same like in a lake. It means the bottom. Way down at the bottom, where there's no sunlight and the creatures are adapted to very, very high pressure and no sunlight. You've got creatures down here that contain symbiotic bacteria within their tissues, specifically tube worms. These tube worms are carrying out chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is the basis of deep ocean food chains. They're using methane and hydrogen sulfide that are coming out of deep ocean vents to create glucose. Okay, so for the longest time, and I mean a long time, scientists theorized that there was no life at the bottom of the ocean. Well, I mean, you can imagine that they theorized that because sunlight doesn't get down there. What's the basis of food chains? Well, it's photosynthesis. If there's no light, then there's no production of, there's no photosynthesis, so there's no production of glucose amongst producers. When we finally had a submersible that could go all the way down to the bottom, and that was in the 1970s, researchers were absolutely stunned, and I mean stunned, to find life. Not just a little life, but lots of life at the bottom of the ocean. And they could not figure out how this was possible. Like what was the basis of the food webs down here? And it took a while for us to figure it out, but we found out that chemosynthesis, taking methane and hydrogen sulfide from deep ocean vents, bacteria can actually take these compounds and create glucose out of them. Now remember that this is symbiotic bacteria that's living in the tissues of other creatures down there, particularly a type of creature known as a tube worm. And you would have heard about this during biology, hopefully. Okay, here's zones of the open ocean. I told you that we were going to talk a little bit about this. Now, there's some extra words on here that you do not have to concern yourself about. Like the pelagic realm right here. Do not worry about the pelagic realm. I'm going to cross it out. This is not something that you need to know. Crossing it out. All right, so let's take this from left to right. Here's our intertidal zone. We talked about our intertidal zone. So we've got high water level and low water level, and this is the area between high and low, okay? That's our intertidal zone. In this particular diagram, it looks like it's a rocky intertidal zone, but remember, intertidal zones can vary a lot in what they look like. The continental shelf comes next, and I mentioned that here. This is the area where sunlight can penetrate all the way to the ocean bottom. It ranges in its depth depending upon what the edge of the continent looks like, and different continents on different tectonic plates have different continental shelf thicknesses and depths. This whole area from the intertidal zone to the end of the continental shelf is your most biodiverse in the ocean. There's all kind of algae, there's all kinds of phytoplankton, there are plants here, there are all types of animals that are here. This between the shore and the end of the continental shelf is your most biodiverse. And when I say that, I mean per unit area, however you choose to define that. If that's meter or hectare, this is going to be your most biodiverse area between the shore and the drop off to your continental shelf. When you get to this drop off, and again, you know, it's hard for you to believe me because there's all these things that they've drawn out there in the deep ocean. But if you were actually in the deep ocean, this stuff wouldn't all be jammed into a little area. They're spread out over a very, very, very large area. So again, when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about the number of organisms per unit area. And the open ocean is less biodiverse than this intertidal continental shelf area right here. If we look along the side here, the photic zone is the area where the light penetrates. And they're giving you kind of some examples of creatures that hang out in the photic zone. Obviously, you're going to have phytoplankton there because phytoplankton are doing photosynthesis. Phyto means plant-like. Zooplankton, these are both types of algae. Phytoplankton means plant-like algae, and they are actually doing photosynthesis. Zooplankton, zoo means animal-like. So this is a type of algae that's actually animal-like. They are not autotrophic, they're heterotrophic, but they're also hanging out in the photic zone. You've got your aphotic zone here. And if you remember me talking on the last slide, I talked about there's the aphotic zone ranges from kind of what they call the twilight area, where there's a little bit of sunlight penetrating, to profoundly dark. And that's this area here. Absolutely no light. Everything underneath here is adapted to very, very high pressure and no light at all. And this, if you can see in this very little corner right here, this is like a methane or hydrogen sulfide vent in the deep ocean. And these deep ocean vents are the source of the chemicals that the bacteria and tube worms use to create the basis of food webs in the deep ocean. But aphotic zone, no light, and it ranges from twilight area where it's low light, and there's still stuff hanging out, sperm whales, hadgetfish, octopi are down there, to really, really the bottom of the ocean. And again, notice that the benthic realm is over here. The benthic just means it's seafloor. So the benthic realm can range from photic all the way to aphotic. Over here in the intertidal and continental shelf area, the benthic realm is photic. When you get past the continental shelf, the benthic realm is aphotic. Benthic just means it's on the bottom.